Okay, look to me. Yeah, part of it is scientists say starting to stuff down. And if our they don't actually have stuff outside the area, and they just start. It's gonna do that.
How are the donuts? Made fresh every morning. Delightful. So recently, I was several times actually in Lake Pyramid, just outside of kayak. And a park ranger told us about this shipwreck. Yeah. And the water is so clear up here on there. They're only like 20 feet down. Very clear. All same place.
But they everything is in control. Yeah. So I'll just grab it from up there and then I'll get We have 2 minutes, it means that they don't shut until.
You're right in the middle of winter?
Or 3 minutes after. Precision time. Yeah.
Yeah. Or one of them. Let's go.
Yes.
I'm gonna duck out like right at 4. I'm gonna go play golf.
I'm just glad it's not going to be a
Yeah.
You've heard me say when I'm
I'm trying to make it like a point of like, there's also a question. Leaving my camera on. It's a surprise. Yeah. I mean, I always sit down. I don't know if sit down. Andrew doesn't sit down.
I think that would be something that more people show up.
Oh, good Lord. Someone's mentioned someone. I don't know.
No, I've been getting all of that. For sure. Much appreciated.
Those socks. You know the color? So you can always tell Canadian always suddenly sit somewhere on the backpack's not weird. It's like something like Roots Canada, like have something that's really good.
See, when I just look around, I'm like, well, there's a more to them. But you know.
And they do a whole bunch of wool blankets. Yeah. And they have it already. And we do a couple of them. So you had the original of this is that is like so expensive. And we had like a version of it, and like wool blankets. So it's not the bang. Well, and so sure you do it. I need to have one. Check out the hundreds of dollars. Yes. Really?
I know. No, I was giving a essential student the So it's like, we may have people still in one for a second. Just. But we are at like exactly.
Hello, everyone. Go green. Good. This is always really fun to kick off our Colloquium Series. So welcome to the first of many talks of our 23-24 Colloquium Series. I'm going to have Sue do the proper introduction for our noteworthy speaker and longtime friend of many faculty of this department. But I wanted to welcome you all to this year's Colloquium Series. This is a great time for us not only to learn about other people's research, but also to engage with each other. We're going to have a non-obligatory happy hour later. If I'm there by myself, that's okay. But I prefer to be with you. So you are welcome to join at Reno's East at some point after this event. And I also want to welcome the people that may be behind this live stream here. Several of our alum join us in that fashion. And so thank you to Hee Jung and Ruth for setting that up for us. Thank you very much. But without wasting any more of your time, let me hand this over to our leader, Sue Lim, who will introduce our speaker.
Sue.
Cool. Hi, everybody. I guess I'm supposed to say go green today. It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Joe Hamm. Today we had lunch, and he's so funny. I'm really passionate about his research. I love it. But his program of research lies at the nexus of governance and the public, where he investigates what trust is, how best to appropriately measure it, which I'm sure is hard, and its connection to outcomes like cooperation and compliance, which are very important. Dr. Hamm works closely with a variety of organizations, including police agencies. He actually talked a little bit about that today during lunch. Court systems, natural resource authorities, public health organizations, basically all the most important organizations out there. And he has this overarching goal of contributing to a cross-boundary social science of trust that is both theoretically and practically relevant. And outside of research, he does a lot of biking and loves traveling. And so without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Hamm.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here and talk with you all a little bit about this intersection of trust and vulnerability. There we go. Okay. Well, by way of an introduction, I did my PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I completed the law psychology program in their social track. So this is really focused on applying the theories and methods of social psychology to understanding how people interact as part of and within the legal system. In terms of my work experience, I've got the opportunity to play in a few different sandboxes, but I did pretty much go directly from my primary assistantship at the University of Nebraska, studying public engagement and trust, onto my position here at MSU. But there was a bit of a formal pit stop at the National Center for State Courts, where I got to spend some time learning to decipher court data as part of their attempts to kind of better serve their communities. At MSU, my position sits across a couple of different units, but what really links them all together is a bit of a passion for trying to make sense out of what trust is, especially in this governance relationship. So most of my time is spent on that pretty typical cycle of projects and papers that we'll go through here in just a minute, and then I do a little bit of classroom instruction on trust specifically, but also a bit in research methods and interdisciplinary science. But I also get to supervise the teaching, researching, and understanding the social science of trust lab, and to serve as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Trust Research. And if you'll forgive the brief detour, I'll mention these both in case these are opportunities that might be of interest to this group. So the Trust Lab serves as an incubator for student-led trust research. And our primary goal is to try and connect students from across campus with an interest in this area of work. But we also try and connect students where we can with organizations that are very interested of themselves in the kinds of things that we're doing. And we have a little bit of internal funding as well. So we're kind of set up in a really good position to be able to help students get the opportunity to do this hands-on leading of research in an interdisciplinary environment. And similarly, the journal is very interested in really anything that advances our thinking about trust, but we're very interested in trying to combine across perspectives and across disciplines to make sense out of trust. And we have published some things that are pretty core to the idea of communication. So we've done one recently on measuring trust in media sources, for example. But as you all know, communication is really fairly central to this idea of trust, especially in that trustee has to communicate that they're worthy of being trusted in that relationship. So really everything that we do has some connection to the kinds of processes and dynamics you're all very familiar with. But coming back to the point for today, what I want to do with the rest of my time is to spend a little time talking about this broad idea of governance. And to do that, I'll start by talking about the idea itself and why it matters. But I'm going to move pretty quickly into a few papers and projects to give you a feel for the kind of work that I've done in this space. And I'll try and organize those around the story that I think that my contribution to this literature really tells, what I have added to this area. So the plan is to start with legitimacy as an idea, as this is really kind of where most conversations about modern governance start. But we're going to use it really just to contextualize this conversation about trust specifically. And then I'm going to use what we know about trust generally to make the argument for vulnerability as being an especially important part of this. And then I'll take a little bit of time to speak to the kinds of characteristics that are needed to assuage that feeling of vulnerability. That'll then set up a conversation about how trustees can best signal that they're worthy of being entrusted with those vulnerabilities. And at that point, I'm going to switch gears just a little bit to talk about some theorizing that I'm currently working on with some colleagues, where we're trying to make sense out of how trust and distrust start to take on lives of their own within individuals, and then how they become part of a social level phenomena. So with any luck, there'll be a little bit of something here for everyone, but I'm really interested in hearing how these ideas intersect with the kinds of things you all are doing. And with any luck, we should have a bit of time in the Q&A to go over some of that. But for now, let's just go ahead and dive in. So in order to talk productively about this idea of trust and governance, we really kind of need to start with a basic idea, the whole point of this. And this is going to be an extremely simplified version of all of this, but society is made up of people. But more specifically, it's made up of individual agentic actors that have the opportunity to make deliberate decisions with regard to other people. Something that at least looks like free will. And so what that means is that basically one of us at basically any time could make decisions that could hurt someone else. And since the rest of us don't have any way to really completely predict or control that, we're all pretty fundamentally uncertain and therefore pretty fundamentally vulnerable. In fact, some would argue that this constant uncertainty about whether or not we would experience harm is kind of the centerpiece of what it means to be human. So what do we do with this constant state of potential injury? Well, one of the main answers in the literature here would be what's called interpersonal, or when it's scaled up across people, social trust. And there's quite a bit of work in this literature that's a little bit out of scope for my own, but basically the argument, the point I'm trying to make here is that even when we have these really strong social or interpersonal trusting ties, most societies still tend to organize themselves around the other piece of this answer to this question of vulnerability, which is the development of rules and norms. So the idea here is that if we have some set of regulations, which can run the gamut from very formal to very informal, we actually reduce some of the uncertainty that we would experience within our daily lives by dictating acceptable and unacceptable behavior. But the challenge here is that in order for this to work, we usually need, or at least we assume that we need, some sort of a system of enforcement. So when we're talking about governance, we're usually talking about this combination of rules and norms, as well as these enforcement mechanisms that exist within a particular context, with this pretty fundamental goal of trying to reduce the uncertainty that might otherwise get in the way of our cooperation. In fact, some would argue that this is a bedrock of human society, such that it's really hard to advance and to work with somebody else and take a risk when you don't know whether or not you'd be taken advantage of in that context. But again, the challenge is that, as you might have guessed from this particularly menacing picture of enforcement that I chose for this, is that by empowering these individuals to enforce these rules and norms, we have necessarily created a power differential. We have necessarily set up a situation where, even though we have rules and norms that guide their behavior, we don't necessarily know what they're going to do. So our efforts to address social vulnerability up here at the top left actually don't so much go away as they really get moved and changed into a different type of vulnerability to this group down here at the bottom right. And contrary to the sentiment of this enforcement picture that I have here, when this process works, that vulnerability is usually accepted. And as we'll get to in the next few slides, this really is the essence of trust. So moving into the papers and projects part of this, the first paper I want to talk about is a theoretical piece where my colleagues and I tried to organize and collect the state of the literature on legitimacy theory. So in that piece, we start from a pretty generally understood idea of legitimacy as the right to rule. And so using that language from that previous slide, this is really about the appropriateness of empowering those enforcement individuals with that extra power they need to do their jobs. Now, there's a lot of potential reasons why we might believe that a particular authority has this right to rule over us. That can run from anything from this idea that some kind of a deity has ordained it, or some kind of national direct democracy election. But in this literature, we tend to think about, in particular, the process by which that empowerment is used. And the argument is that authorities are more legitimate when they are thought to use that power appropriately. So stealing heavily from this piece by Anthony Bottoms and Justice Tankerby that I have cited up here, we created the concentric diagram of legitimacy as a visual representation of what Bottoms and Tankerby call this dialogue of legitimacy. And basically, we're arguing that how power holders use their enforcement, so what we have here is this authority line, has a reciprocal relationship with how the public responds, or this acquiescence below. And then we organize that literature to make the argument that there really are four theoretical mechanisms that impact that middle dialogue. And that is this organizational support that power holders feel that they have, the extent to which they feel that the public approves of them are really going to shape how they set up their authority, how they structure that. While these interactions with the legal actors and the social context more generally is going to shape that public acquiescence side of this. So the second paper takes this idea of legitimacy and tries to focus specifically on the role that trust plays in this area of the figure here. And so just like that last paper, we started with a bit of a conceptual conversation about how trust is usually discussed in this literature. But what we do in this paper is to highlight a version of trust that comes out of the organizational sciences that makes the argument that trust is really about this willingness to accept vulnerability. So like I mentioned, this is a paper that's really heavily cited, comes out of the organizational sciences, but it's influenced a lot of thinking about what trust is in a lot of different areas. And kind of the centerpiece of the paper is that trust is really about some recognition of potential injury that truster has that's controlled by that particular trustee. And specifically about their willingness to accept that vulnerability. And to make that make sense, consider a trust fall. So even in this really simple scene, it's pretty clear why this is a situation of trust. I mean, we have one individual who is at potential of experiencing some injury and another individual that controls that potential harm. So when we trust, we more or less consciously recognize that the other person could make some sort of decision that could hurt us, and we feel generally okay with that. And so we created a measure to address this specific version of vulnerability or specific version of trust as a willingness to accept vulnerability in the policing context. And for those of you not familiar with reading these kinds of diagrams, or who can't read it from the back, I can't talk about how small it is. Basically, what we have on the far left are these two measures of procedural fairness. So this is the extent to which law enforcement treats people fairly. And those are predicting this joint construct here of trustworthiness and normative alignment, where normative alignment is this sense that the police share the values of the public. Now, I have to caveat this and say this is cross-sectional data. So we are not able to test the causal relationships that I'm kind of implying here. But the covariance that we do find is consistent with the idea that this trust, this willingness to accept vulnerability, is at least part of what's explaining the relationship between trustworthiness and normative alignment and these cooperation variables. So if we're right about the causal sequence we're arguing for here, being treated fairly by the police, or feeling that the police generally treat people fairly, causes us to have these evaluations of them to think they have these positive characteristics, which we then internalize as this feeling of a willingness to accept vulnerability, which is at least part of why we then go on to cooperate with them. So if this idea of the public's willingness to accept vulnerability really does play this mediating role in the relationship of cooperation, it would seem the next thing we'd want to know is a little bit more about the content of these vulnerabilities themselves and maybe their distribution. So here, with this particular paper, we started with the idea that trust is premised on this management of vulnerability, and then made the argument that there's at least two kinds of vulnerability that most people experience in their relationships with the police. So the first is what we call vulnerability to external harm. And here we focused on a measure that addresses the extent to which our participants felt that they were afraid of crime. See which one part of this I moved for that. So this vulnerability is going to be external, and that it comes from outside of that police community relationship. So crime is something that it's a threat the police are intended to address, but it's not necessarily something, usually isn't something their behavior causes. So it's relational, but it's outside of the specific relationship itself, or the decisions outside of the relationship. We then contrasted that with what we call vulnerability to internal harm. And here we operationalize this as the negative impacts of police action. And so our goal in this project was to try and understand whether people feel this vulnerability, this internal vulnerability to the police. And if they do, to understand what role it plays in setting their level of trust. Now, we were also interested in the external harm part of this, but there's a lot of work on fear of crime out there. And so we spent a bit less time making sense out of that one. But what we find for internal harm is this. So to quickly orient you to this graph, the three different colored bars here are three different demographic groups we collected data from. So we collected data from 600 individuals who self-identified as non-Muslim white, 600 who identified as non-Muslim black, and an additional 600 that identified as Muslim. We then asked them 8 questions that were drawn from the psychometric paradigm of risk perception. And those ask our participants the extent to which they feel that experiencing that police-caused harm would be a consequence of their choices, whether the effects would be immediate or delayed, whether they feel that people like them know about those harms or people in power know about them, whether they can control their exposure to the police in the first place, whether the police harm affects many people or one person, whether they feel dread about it, and whether they think it's generally severe. So if we focus on just the blue lines here, these are virtually always the most different. And that suggests that our non-Muslim white participants felt the least vulnerability. And for this one here on control of exposure, it's conceptually flipped. So higher numbers here are more control over exposure, which should suggest less vulnerability. What's a little more interesting, though, is where and how our Muslim participants diverged from our non-Muslim black participants. So these groups were 2 that we chose because they are typically subject to the most intense anti-terror or community policing. And you'll see a few of these that are fairly similar, but where they were statistically significantly different, it was always our non-Muslim black participants who felt the most vulnerability. And there's a lot of reasons for why these 2 groups in particular may have been different from each other that honestly we don't do a whole lot with in the paper. But what this does suggest is that at least our participants, which do include these non-Muslim white individuals, feel some level of vulnerability toward the police. And it's not evenly distributed within society as we might have expected. But what we go on to do is to test the role that these dimensions of internal harm or dimensions of the vulnerability to internal harm, what role they play in predicting trust when you've also got this external harm, this fear of crime in the same model. And what we end up finding is that when you account for both, external harm is no longer predictive of trust. And so while we do have both this vulnerability to internal harm and external harm when we're talking about the police, when we're talking about setting our level of trust, it's really about that vulnerability to the decisions and the actions that they have more direct control of. That's more important for setting that level of trust. So if this vulnerability to internal harm is the centerpiece of trust, then our next question might be how we might assuage that. Or what can police do to make people willing to accept their vulnerability? And to answer this question, this project shifted our thinking a little bit. And so instead of asking about how different people feel, what we did here was try to understand how different situations might create different types of internal vulnerability. So it's certainly true that people could experience the exact same harms in each one of these situations. But what we argued was that for the most part, when you're thinking about interacting with law enforcement after you've been caught speeding, or you're misidentified as a thief, or you've been a victim of a crime and now the police have been called, or there's just a particular officer who patrols your community, there are different things you're focused on that could go wrong in each of those situations. So we argued that the potential harm caused by the police is going to be, so we have two dimensions that we think you can separate these on. And if it's as small for you as it is for me at the back of the room, that may be hard to read. But what we're arguing is the two dimensions are severity and concreteness. And so we made the argument that when you are misidentified as a perpetrator or the victim of a crime, the potential thing that could go wrong in that situation is more severe than it would be in the other two scenarios. But when you are misidentified as a perpetrator, the thing that could go wrong there is much more concrete than what could go wrong if you called the police after being involved, after being a victim of a crime. Where the primary thing, now that that crime has happened, the primary thing that officer can really do or get wrong is address the extent to which you feel safe now after that violation. So it's a bit more of an amorphous injury. So what we did was to ask each of our participants to imagine themselves in each one of these situations, and then to envision the officer they would most want to interact with the argument being that the officer they'd most want to interact with should be the situation that would make them feel least vulnerable to that potential internal harm. So have any of you ever played those video games where you get to create your own character and you get a certain number of points, you get to assign over a certain number of attributes? It's exactly what we did here. We asked them to envision themselves in each of these situations and then gave them three different characteristics they could increase and 8 points they could assign across them. And what we find is this, a little bit complicated. Very bottom of this words that are turned sideways are the characteristics that we use. So we took these from procedural justice, the procedural justice literature, and this is a willingness to listen, respectful treatment, and a lack of bias. Beneath that are the 4 scenarios. So whether you were pulled over for speeding, misidentified as a perpetrator, or a victim of a crime, or you live in a community that officer is patrolling. And beneath that are our 2 samples. So our complete sample is the full 317 people who completed this survey, but our experienced subsamples are the subset of that complete group who identified in the survey that they had personally experienced these situations in their own lives. And the argument was that these are going to be people who are going to have real world experience to draw on when thinking about what they want in these interactions. And really the big difference between the experienced and the complete sample is just that these confidence intervals are much larger because we're dealing with much smaller samples, especially in this misidentified situation. But across all of the conditions, what we find is that our participants emphasize a willingness to listen and respectful treatment, and they de-emphasize this lack of bias. Now, this does not mean that they want a biased officer. We told our participants they were starting with an average officer. So any positive number on this at all, anything above this 0 line, is an increase over the average officer. But when they're given the opportunity to increase all 3 of these, what we see is that, so this line at 2.67 here is where those all should have been if they had on average, evenly emphasized each of them. So anything above that line is something they emphasized, and anything below that line is where they took those points away from. So when they had the opportunity to increase all 3 of them equivalently, they seemed to take the points away from these lack of bias and put them into this willingness, the willingness to listen and respectful treatment. But what makes this a little bit more interesting is if you look at the speeding scenario and the patrol scenario, so the 2 scenarios where we thought this internal harm would be least severe, our participants want just as much of both of those constructs. Those confidence intervals are overlapping. But where we thought that internal harm was more severe, our participants want statistically significantly more of the willingness to listen. So if these specific characteristics, like this willingness to listen and this respectful treatment, are key to getting the public to be comfortable with accepting their vulnerability, how do you get that message to the public? I mean, you can certainly just do the thing and listen more and be more respectful, but most agencies don't interact with most people. And even when they do interact with them, they typically come into that interaction with some kind of an understanding of what would happen then. So while treatment is important, the other piece of this is communication. And in this literature, we would talk about this as being trustworthiness signaling specifically. Now, in a lot of ways, this really is public relations, but what makes it specific to trustworthiness signaling is this goal of getting this idea across, that that specific trustee is worthy of being trusted. And much of how that's typically done is usually by insisting on exactly that, just saying, I am trustworthy and you should trust me. And there's actually a bit of literature that suggests what things to focus on in those interactions. One of the best tested relationships in all of the trust literature is about the connection between trust and these three specific dimensions of trustworthiness. So it's almost always the case that a trustee is going to be more trusted when they have the ability, they're believed to have the ability to do what they're trusted to do, the benevolence to actually care about that trustor, and the integrity to adhere to a good internal moral code. But what can you do to make people actually believe those signals? I mean, is there anything that you can do to increase the odds that signaling would be successful? And the answer is obviously yes, and I would think there are a number of people in this audience in particular that have a lot of ideas for how to increase the credibility or the effectiveness of that messaging. But we'd argue that from a trust perspective, there's at least something else going on here as well. So when agencies are tasked with trustworthiness signaling, you often see them move pretty quickly away from mass messaging and toward relying on representatives that can build relationships. And there's a lot of credibility relevant reasons why that relationship might make them more likely to be believed. But from a trust perspective, if you think back to this idea of trust as being a willingness to accept vulnerability, and trustworthiness as being the reason why you would accept that potential for injury, it's pretty clear, or it makes a lot of sense, that the fit between that salient vulnerability that individual feels and that trustworthiness signaling becomes really important. So if your agency is spending all of its time talking about why it's really trustworthy with regard to one vulnerability, and your community is really very concerned about a very different one, it's at least going to be less effective. But if those vulnerabilities conflict with each other, you might even see how it could be counterproductive. But given that humans are pretty fundamentally vulnerable, the question is, which vulnerability should you be focusing in on? And another paper we're currently working on argues that the answer here is something we call focal vulnerability. And so our argument is that when you're trying to address trustworthiness, you don't have to address every vulnerability that your potential person feels, just the ones that exist within that specific relationship. And using that language from a couple slides ago, this would include both internal and external harm, but it wouldn't include anything that your trustor does not think you are responsible for. Another one of the elements of this focal vulnerability, though, is that it must be perceived. So this is specifically what that trustor feels their vulnerability is and how they understand it. And the last part of it is that that vulnerability must be present. Now, this is the most abstract part of this, but our vulnerabilities within relationships are constantly emerging. So I might feel very willing to accept my vulnerability to someone today, but over the course of that relationship, discover a bunch of different ways that I'm vulnerable to them. What matters when we're setting that level of trust, though, is what we think that vulnerability looks like as we set that level of trust, and not how it might change into the future. And the reason why I dragged you through all of that is to talk to you about a project we're currently doing with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. So in this project, which builds on some work that Jim led in the past, we've selected 3 Michigan communities in Saginaw, Otsego, and St. Clair Shores. And what we're doing is to work with the MDHHS to develop a way to collect salient community concerns, to work those back into the MDHHS's efforts to communicate health information to those communities, and then to try to make sense out of how successful we were. So as of now, we finished the first of 5 annual surveys that we'll be doing in these communities. And the centerpiece of that was several questions where we asked participants about the harms they feel in the relationship with MDHHS as it pertains to keeping their communities healthy. And what you're seeing here is part of a report back flyer that we prepared for the city of Saginaw. And the dark green bars here represent the percentage of people in these communities who argue that each of these issues, these are drawn from the structural determinants of health. Each of these green bars represents the percentage of our participants who argued that these problems were a huge or an important concern in their community. And what this suggests is that as they think about their relationship with MDHHS, it's not really just about one area. And so if MDHHS is doing a great job of showing that it is very trustworthy with regard to one of them, it's still a bit of a more complicated picture than that. So I've covered a lot of information, and I want to take a quick step back to kind of cover where we've gone so far. So we started with this idea of legitimate government, and from that we pulled this idea of trust as centered on this willingness to accept vulnerability. And that we argued that there's a couple different types of that vulnerability, but that trust is mostly built on those internal vulnerabilities actually controlled by that trustee. And made the argument that trustworthiness signaling is going to be most likely to be successful when it specifically targets the vulnerability, that focal vulnerability that trustee feels. This is all pretty limited, right? And this is what's happening pretty cognitively in the mind of one individual who is or is not receiving some information about the trustworthiness of one particular trustee. And that is certainly important, but the way that this works in the real world has got to be more complicated than this. And so where I want to shift things a little bit at this point is to talk about some of this theorizing we're doing to try and make sense out of what actually happens in context. So what if we find ourselves in a relationship that's in a great place? And so we find ourselves in a state of trust. Or a relationship that's gone particularly poorly, and so we find ourselves in a state of distrust. Those two states are going to be determined, as we've discussed, by this willing or unwillingness to accept that focal vulnerability. And in the case of trust, that's going to facilitate a willingness to be more involved, to cooperate more in that relationship. In the case of distrust, that's going to trigger a desire or an attempt to reduce the interdependence in that relationship. But now let's focus just on a state that you're less likely to want to stay in, so probably going to be distrust here. How do you move a relationship that's in distrust into a state of trust instead? Well, if we stop the presentation now, you would assume that the argument is something along the lines of figure out what that salient vulnerability is and communicate to that trustor, you can be entrusted with that specific vulnerability. But it's not quite that simple, right? I mean, especially when we find ourselves in a state of distrust, we often tend to get kind of stuck there. So there at least has to be something else that's going on. And one of the arguments about one of the perspectives on what could be happening there is this idea of stable states. So without going too far into the nuts and bolts, stable states is an idea we borrow from resilience theory, which is a primarily ecological theory that seeks to understand what are called regime shifts. And in that literature, pictures like this are incredibly common. And what they try and signal is this idea that a single system, so the same water body, can exist in a few different potential states, like the coral here on the left or the algae that's on the right. So the argument in the theory is that the system state, which is represented by this orange ball here, you can push on it a little bit to either direction, and it's gonna wanna stay in the same basic area until it hits a threshold, after which it's gonna cross over and now want to stay in this other state. And we basically make the argument that this is exactly what's happening with trust. So when we're in a state of trust, we're resilient to some level of disturbance until we hit some kind of a threshold, after which we move over into the other state of distrust specifically. Now, there's been a little bit of work that's addressed this kind of idea specifically with regard to trust. And so these are called trust traps. These are the dynamics that lock relationships into a state of trust when the available information suggests that it really shouldn't be trusting. What we wanted to do in this paper was to make sense out of what's happening here on the distrust side. So the paper I'm going to talk through here is a collaboration with a group of faculty and community leaders in the city of Flint, Michigan. So after the water crisis became public knowledge, researchers from around the country really descended on the community And it was a really important way to try and make sense out of what was happening. But it did challenge a pretty fundamental value within that community. So Flint has been long studied for a number of social issues, and it's gotten really savvy in the research process to the point where it has its own internal review board for projects that are going to be done within that city. What this means, though, is that there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of interest in that community on capturing that community's own voice through academics and community leaders that are working in that community. And that's exactly what we tried to do here. So the larger project's final report, which I'm happy to share with anyone who'd like to see it, details a series of focus groups. There were two kind of parts of this, but one of the phases of this was a series of focus groups, where again, our goal was to try and capture that community's perspective of experiencing the water crisis. We very much entered that process assuming that trust was going to be a big part of this. So it did feature prominently in those focus groups. But again, this was going to be that inductive part of the analysis. But as we worked through the data, we found a lot of the same dynamics that you would find in this resilience theory argument. So we actually went back and reanalyzed the trust code to look for evidence of essentially this. So to walk you through what you're looking at, we argue that trust and distrust are best represented as two adjacent states or two adjacent basins of attraction that are separated by this threshold. And starting with the threshold, the state of ambivalence here would be characterized by a high degree of uncertainty. So they're super high in this downward arrow. And it's specifically about whether or not that vulnerability is protected. So they're in the middle of this lateral arrow. And the big thing to note here is that this is it's a pretty precarious state, right? So in most relationships that we care about, we're going to experience a lot of pressure to want to be certain about that relationship. And that has to manifest either as certainty about the vulnerability being protected or not being protected. And if you think back to that idea of trustworthiness signaling, this is where that's going to be most likely to be effective. So if you're an agency and you're able to speak to someone in this ambivalent state and give them some evidence that you are protecting their vulnerability, that desire for certainty, as long as it's a domain they care about, that desire for certainty should push them down into that trust basin. On the other hand, if they get information that suggests to them that that vulnerability is not protected, that exact same desire for certainty is going to push them into that distrust basin. But in either case, what really matters here is that just pushing left or right can get you into this basin, but getting back out requires a new upward pressure. So when you're trying to unwind distrust, or you're trying to do something about distrust, you can't just apply this kind of leftward pressure of saying that vulnerability is protected. You have to separately unwind that desire for confidence in that area to get them back up and over that threshold. And recognizing that I am very deep in a very theoretical paper, I'm going to complicate this just a little bit more by showing what is admittedly a very complicated figure, but one that I'm just using to make one point, which is that when you find yourself in a state of distrust, it may be easiest not to try and push that ball back up and over the threshold, but instead to use the negative pressure that you had from being in this state to push you all the way into trust in a new relationship. Because when we distrust, we are still vulnerable and we still need some kind of a relationship to protect us. So if I can push this idea, this theoretical world of things just a little bit further, this idea that being in a distrusting state could push you toward trust in a new target is the centerpiece of a book chapter that we're currently working on, where we're trying to explore this idea of vulnerability or managing vulnerability as a social level phenomenon. So coming back to this fundamental idea of why we have government in the first place, we argue that individuals who feel vulnerable create and then lean into relationships designed to try and assuage at least the feeling of that vulnerability. So when we feel vulnerable to fire, we create fire departments. When we feel vulnerable to market swings, we create the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, in both of these cases, these groups can do something about this original, what we would call imposed vulnerability that's non-relational. But really the only way they can do that is by making that original vulnerability a relational vulnerability to them. It's now an external vulnerability within that relationship. But what happens if we're not willing to accept that vulnerability? Well, using this dynamic so far, we might think that what we might just do is create new relationships and try and move the vulnerability into them instead. And in fact, that's exactly what we find. So if we don't trust fire departments to manage fire, or we don't trust the SEC to actually ensure fairness in trading, our system is set up to rely instead on the courts, where we could sue them, or on legislatures where we could elect people who would actually take these agencies to task. So what's important here is that what we find ourselves doing is not so much getting rid of our vulnerability, but trying to find, to create, and to move it into a different relationship where that vulnerability feels more acceptable. So much like the laws regarding the conservation of energy, we make the argument that there is a conservation of vulnerability in social systems, as we try and find new places to put that vulnerability so we can convert it from what feels like a felt or unacceptable vulnerability into one that simply exists, but that we feel pretty good about. And our argument is that we do this as humans pretty seamlessly. So we have our own imposed vulnerabilities to injury that we convert into relational vulnerabilities with our primary healthcare providers that have their own internal and external vulnerabilities as we set our level of trust. But over time, they change into these emergent vulnerabilities as that relationship develops. And to make that make just a little bit more sense, these ideas are heavily drawn off of the dissertation of one of my former graduate students, who used exactly this to trace the relationships or the vulnerability in the relationships in the victim impact statements of the sexual assault survivors from Dr. Larry Nassar's case, where they had these imposed vulnerability to injury that converted into this relational vulnerability to a doctor that very much had different vulnerabilities in their mind than what emerged over the course of that relationship. And in case these ideas are particularly interesting, I'll leave you with just two thoughts about two things we're trying to do with this in future research. One of them is in the public health context, and the argument we're trying to make there is that a large number really of unacceptable vulnerabilities create a need for the trusted relationships with community clinics in particular. And the other one is in the criminal legal context, where we make the argument that judges play a vulnerability broker role. And so what they're really doing is deciding which vulnerabilities within that community are going to be addressed by the criminal justice system, and then which one is going to be exacerbated. So that was a lot. Thank you so much for sticking with me through all of it. I'm hopeful that the kinds of things that I've gone through today might intersect with some of the things that you're all working on, but I'm more than happy to do any kind of clarifying questions or to speculate to how this might address some totally different things as well. And to try and facilitate that conversation, I just want to hit the major things that we went over the course of that presentation. So we started with this idea of governance relationships as intentional relationships designed to address at least the feeling of vulnerability. And we traced that through legitimacy theory to this argument of trust, specifically as a willingness to accept vulnerability that governance agencies can foster when they effectively communicate that they are worthy of being entrusted with those specific focal vulnerabilities. And then we turned to a couple of nascent theories that my co-authors and I are trying to develop to try and make sense out of how all of this works in context. Thank you so much. Questions? Yeah.
So this idea of vulnerability and looking to find another kind of place for certainty, especially in law enforcement, where does the community fit within that in terms of if you have maybe a agency that you think is reflective of the community, are you going to feel more trust and less vulnerability just because you feel like they represent you or similar to you, as opposed to one that you might feel like is outside being imposed?
So the signals that you would take to try and make sense out of whether your vulnerability is likely to be protected. So if you're looking at an agency and you're trying to decide, will they protect my focal vulnerability, whatever that ends up being? It makes a lot of sense that you would look for something like, are they like me? Do they understand me? Do they know me? Does that make a difference for them? And so you could see how a more representative agency might lead people to believe that that vulnerability will be protected and to be more willing to accept it. It doesn't quite work that way in practice, though. So changing the makeup of a police force does not have at least the amount of effect on changing trust you would want it to. And the argument there is likely just that that signal becomes less important in some contexts. And so you might think of that as being a politicized relationship with law enforcement. And so when I think about policing generally, I'm not necessarily thinking about my agency, which might reflect me. I'm thinking about a larger institution, and I have a more negative relationship with it. And so I'm drawing more on that negative relationship with the institution versus the individual organization. But it makes all of the sense in the world. That's the kind of thing you would draw on for a cue, as long as there's not something else pushing in a different direction. And I think we usually see in these examples where they have the natural experiment, we diversified a police force, how do people feel about it? You don't see as much as you want to see. Yeah.
Thanks for this, Joe. This is really awesome. So I have a question about scaling trust.
Okay.
So a lot of the evidence here, which is super, super compelling, is kind of like interpersonal in nature, or at least more close community oriented. Are the dynamics in play still at the societal level? Like I'm thinking of the metaphor of the trust fall, right? That is personal. Is there a societal trust fall, or is there like a social level trust fall, and what does that actually look like?
I'm not going to have a great answer for you on this one. And the reason I'm not going to have a great answer is this, the paper that we have in Ecology and Society, the one with the stable states in it, my co-author, the second author on that, is a sociologist. And we spent the entire time writing that paper talking about trust, for me, very psychologically, and for her, very sociologically. And it was really very interesting to try and make sense out of, so yes, we can have a community, and our community can be very trusting of law enforcement. And so we have a social level trust that's happening there. But in my head, that's still a bunch of individuals deciding whether or not they trust that organization. And so the emergent part of trust, that is something community level uniquely, for me, that tends to be just about norms. That me being a part of a community that trusts law enforcement is going to influence my individual trust, because that's what we do as a community. She makes the argument, though, that there really is a social level process happening there. And I am really looking forward to writing more papers with her and trying to figure out where exactly she's taking that. Because in my own head, it's still a bunch of individuals who are connected. And so it's a social psychological process. These are people being impacted by the norms. We do this, we have narratives, we have these elements of our community. But at the end of that, it's still someone saying, I'm willing or I'm not willing. And not more emergent social level, something beyond that. I need to make more sense out of that, because I've heard people make the argument, I've seen it, I have a co-author who's pushing me on it, but getting to the place where that really makes sense to me, I'm not quite there. I wish it was. If you get there, let me know.
No, that's why I asked it. Like thinking that way is just a different orientation.
It is.
It's interesting. It's just different.
I'm deep in my sight training here, for sure. Yes.
I'm going to piggyback on that. I wish this was more well-formed in my head, but certainly there are certain communities where the sociological level makes sense because there might be a lot of consistency, especially communities that are demographically very similar, let's say.
Yeah.
And so I think about the community I grew up in, the police were just inherently trusted, So whereas, let's say in Cincinnati, Ohio, it might be a little different, right?
Yeah.
So is this really captured within the standard deviation? Right? You could have whatever mean a level of trust, which is a bunch of individuals, but then you can see like what the variance is high.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And don't know what else I want to say about that. Could you just comment on that?
I can't take that one. So there's a movement in the trust literature to think about multi-level trust. And it is a vibrant debate of a place right now where people are making this argument about what is different between an individual's trust, and for most of this is coming out of business organizations. So what does it mean to trust as a person or a team or an entire organization. And there's a lot of debate as to, is it just the standard, is it the variance around it? So what makes a team more or less trusting is not necessarily the mean level of trust of each person in it, but how variable is that team? And you do find effects for that. You do find that the variability within that team predicts different things than the mean would. But the other half of that group is making this more sociological argument that that's still an artifact of the individual levels of trust.
Yeah.
And that there's this desire to move that literature, which I don't want to say is not compelling, but it hasn't sunk in yet for me. I don't quite get where this is going. To make the argument that it has nothing to do with individual level trust. It's not just an artifact of people feeling something or feeling differently about something, that there is a social process that's happening there that really is that multi-level trust. The look of perplexity is exactly where I am.
Yeah.
It's a lively debate. There are definitely people who have very strong opinions that no, it is just the variability. That's how we can quantify it, that's how we can test it, and we find that it predicts different things. But there's that pushback of it can't just be an artifact of individuals. There's a social process there. Thought I saw a hand over there. Yeah.
I've already spoken.
Thank you, Dr. Hamm. I was wondering if you could talk about how you think the communities in Michigan with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and how communal definitions of trust might be different, especially on this multi-layered definition of trust.
Absolutely. So just to pull them up, because I don't think it's that far back, it's further than I thought.
Sorry.
It's different than I thought. Okay. So we picked Saginaw, Otsego, and St. Clair Shores. And when we started this process, we went to the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. So the center that we're working with focuses its attention on dioxins specifically, dioxins and PCBs. And so we went to them and said, what are communities that you're really worried about? What are communities where you're trying to do some sort of outreach, not worried so much as you were trying to do outreach in these areas, you really focused in on them. And these are three that they identified for us, but we got really excited about them because they're very, very different communities. So Saginaw, so our previous work that was led by Jim was all focused in Midland, and down the river from Midland is Saginaw. And so most of the remediation that's been happening from the Dow chemical plant in Midlands has really been upstream until about now. The EPA is more or less now moving into Saginaw to start doing some of their remediation around that bend of the river. So this is a community that is just starting to hear about this. The Midland community has been hearing about this for a very long time. It's been a very important part of that community. But we did a couple listening sessions at neighborhood associations in Saginaw, and no one had any idea what we were talking about. This was a brand new idea for most of them. The EPA is doing a lot. Our listening sessions were maybe 4 years ago. The EPA has been doing a lot of town halls in the last 2 years, so there's probably more awareness now, but this is an emerging issue for them. It's also a majority Black community. So it's an urban community, it's a majority Black community. St. Clair Shores has a 10-mile drain. That is 40 years old, I think, at this point. And the people who actually live on the properties that were contaminated have had their yards dug up at least twice in the last 20 years. So this is an old issue here, but it's also an old issue in a relatively affluent community. So this is a group of people who aren't more socially vulnerable like you might expect in a lower income kind of area. It's a fairly high income area. It's a really kind of nice area of Detroit, honestly. That then is contrasted with Otsego. Now, Otsego has the Menasha Paper Company here. There is a Superfund site down here, this Allied Paper. The Allied Paper site is a Superfund site. The Menasha Corporation up here is not a Superfund site. And as best as the state can tell, there is no possible way for community members in the city of Otsego to be being exposed to dioxins. But the community is incredibly concerned about them. And so part of the reason that these communities end up being so ideal for us is they have very different relationships with the contaminant and are very different of themselves. And so to your question about what trust might mean in these different communities, the vulnerability in St. Clair Shores is minimal. there's a lot of being upset about the amount of intrusion that's happening. We're hearing quite a bit about people saying that, how are we still dealing with this? How are we still talking about this? But what you don't see is the vulnerability that we're talking about more in Otsego, where that is a very different, very much more salient vulnerability and a little bit of a mismatch in how the community is conceptualizing that vulnerability and how the state is. And then it's emerging in Saginaw. And so it ends up being a bit different there. But the broader kind of social vulnerabilities being an additional part. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So general social surveys got awesome data on trust. It's like from the 60s to basically yesterday. But two different types of trust. So interpersonal trust and then institutional trust, mainly about government. So the cool finding is that interpersonal trust is essentially flat since the 60s. Like, I trust you just as much as you trust me, and it's been the same since the 60s. But since the 60s, our trust in government has been plummeting.
Sure.
Is that an artifact of just the target, or is there something unique about trust across those two groups?
There's definitely something unique about the two groups. And so in particular, when you think about, so the items for the personal trust one is, I believe most people can be trusted. I think most people are trying to do the right thing or something along those lines. When you ask people those kinds of questions, they tend to think about their community. So there's some versions of it that actually ask specifically about strangers or people you've never met before. And you get a little bit of distinction there, but for the most part, when people say something, you think about your community, you think about people who are around you. And it makes a lot of sense that when you're thinking about those people, you kind of self-selected for people you feel better about. And so that being fairly stable across time, despite whatever's happening around you, does make a good bit of sense. The decreases in trust in institutions is a really good question. And there's reason to be skeptical that it is quite what it looks like in those surveys. Part of that is that trust has become a thing we talk a lot about, and challenging trust in particular has become something that we're very accepting of. It's not to say that we weren't always, but I do think that there is a readiness to challenge a number of our institutions that might not have historically looked quite the same, at least among the more dominant part of our society. And so it's not clear whether more disenfranchised groups in particular have always had that same level of low trust, and that perspective is just working its way into society, or if the people who are actually completing it themselves have changed. There's strong arguments on this one. People definitely make the argument that if you trace the same person over time and got rid of age effects, the cohort effects, you'd still see that decrease because there's a less trustworthiness there. But how to make sense out of, is this a media effect where now people feel like they know more? Is it a cultural effect where we're more willing to say we don't trust? Is it that society has diversified and so we've lost some of this bowling alone kind of argument? Like, actually empirically separating those, I promise you could find people who tell you it's been done and it's one way or the other, but from where I sit, it's tough. Sure.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So the level of trust, is the organization gets closer to you,
Mhm.
or maybe your community, does the level of trust tend to go up versus, like, I may really distrust the federal government, but I trust my local representative?
Mhm.
And is there some sort of just dichotomy there where it's just by virtue of distance that I feel like they're larger and I'm more vulnerable, so I'm automatically going to distrust them?
We often like what we know. And so to the extent that trust is related to our liking of something, you will often see that increase. You also get the opportunity with a closer and a smaller agency to feel more like you have a good relationship with them. But obviously it's a mediated effect, right? Like, that depends on whether you have a good relationship. So closeness isn't necessarily what's changing it. It's, do you like them in that process? But the other half of this, there's a book coming out of political science. It was one of my advisors on my dissertation committee. But the book is called, like, What Is It About Government That Americans Dislike, or something like that. And basically what they find is that Americans dislike when they hear how this process goes. So the closer they get to the federal government, the more they understand what they call the sausage making of it, the more they don't like it. And so they actually find more trust with more distal things, because then you can just kind of rely on the idea of it and assume that things are going well. But once you start to understand it, you understand how you're vulnerable. You understand what potential injury you could experience. And that actually has a decrease, has a negative impact on your overall trust. It's a little bit complicated.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe I won't vote anymore because I don't want to know.
I'd hate to say that that's what came out of this presentation.
All right, so let's take one more opportunity to thank Joe.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
All right, if some of you have last minute questions, then can I volunteer?
Absolutely.
He is so
Thank you.